The second presenter, K. Mihi Nancy.
Yeah, yes, ma'am. Shall I start, ma'am?
Yeah. Please
Good.
keep to the time, but because the next session is also lined up.
Yeah, okay, ma'am. Okay, sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My title is Woman, the Victim of Infertility in Manchu Kapoor's novels. The word infertility has been defined as the inability to conceive despite cohabitation without the use of contraceptives. But the real suffering of infertility cannot be compared with any other problems in life. The stigma associated with sufferings of the stigma associated with infertility is not restricted to India alone but spreads across the world. It has been considered as a curse in all the cultures since motherhood has been an indispensable female identity and enhances women's social status. Childless women are automatically vulnerable to the charges of being worthless in the society. Women who are unable to bear children for any reason or condemned to suffer the consequences. It leads them get affected physically and emotionally. And the interesting thing to note in infertility is that men do not necessarily go through the same suffering and isolation that the women do, even if they are the cause of infertility. The concept of infertility in mythology has been associated only with women and no stigma ever attached to an important male. It is always the women who get blamed for failing to procreate. The Indian society has been imposing the childbearing only on women, and the infertile women are inhumanly treated by their husband and in-laws for the inability to bear children. In the Vedic period, a barren woman would be cast away because she was considered as an evil and ugly spirit who destroyed everything good. In the Manju Kapoor's novels, I have taken two novels, Home and The Immigrant. These novels revolve around the lives of two sisters. First novel, Home. The novel establishes their identity as infertile women in its very first sentences. The introduction seems to suggest that infertility is one of the common factors that the sisters shares. An exception to the rest of their lives, which are starkly contrasted by their financial and social status. Unlike traditional Indian male who craves for children to carry on lineage and the name of his family, Premnath, the husband of Ruba, being highly educated and learned, is different and has ideas which are considered philosophical by his family members. He did not regret not having children. Part of his capacity to think felt his admiring wife was reflected in his stoicism. To want children was another word for I, me, and mine. It was easier to be free without such attachments, he says. However, unlike Ruba and Sona had never been complacent about their infertility, and nor had she accepted it as her destiny. Living in a joint family, Sona has always resented being unable to fulfill what seems to have to be the basic function of a woman. Her husband Yaspal, who has fallen in love with her at first sight, remains too enamored by her wife to ever blame her for her infertility. Unlike Ruba's husband, Premnath, though he did not desire for children, had expected their life and relationship to improve when the children arrive. However, Sona's inability to produce children does not become preoccupation with Yasbal as it does with Sona. Wright and Jiril suggest that in most cases, among infertile couples, women tend to show higher levels of distress and feelings of incompetence than their male partners. The inability of a woman to meet the demands of the family members leads her to experience guilt and results in a loss of self-esteem, which the man escapes simply because of the comparatively lower pressure that he experiences from those around him. The next novel I have taken is The Immigrant. Here, the protagonist Nina, she too faces the same problem. After her marriage, Nina settles down in Canada with Ananda, her husband, and starts a new life. Her new life comes with many problems and issues of alienation and adaptation. After arriving in Canada, she adopts Western lifestyle and manners. Earlier, her husband Ananda has transformed themselves from the strict vegetarianism to to an to a non-vegetarian. To adjust and is assimilate herself in new culture, Rina changes her food, dress, habits accordingly. Though she converts herself into a follower of a Western culture, her desire to become a mother depicts the mentality of each woman. Nina wants to be a mother that can remove her boredom and loneliness of her grim life. She seems so much eager to be a mother that she consults doctor for cause and demands that Ananda should also come with her for medical checkup. Even though she is childless, both Nina and Ananda pass the medical test successfully. After each and every intercourse, she thinks she will now be pregnant. Her whole life is centered on Ananda and her wish for a child. Childlessness aggravates her anxiety, loneliness, and trauma. Nina feels disgust and hates her own body. She even dislikes her female physical routine like the period, the blood, dry breast, and everything. Kapoor depicts the barrenness in the following manner. There was a storm inside her created by raising the possibility of infertility in front of a group of women and finding her fears were real. On the whole, the infertility plays an important role for the women in the novels, and it's an integral part of their identities, defining the social status and their self image as well. In ancient time, female protagonists were subject to ill treatment or physical abuse, and this has been reflected in several novels over the decades. Infertile women are still regarded as incomplete women and deprived of the prestige of an honor that would be accorded to them if they were mothers. Motherhood thus defines a woman's identity, and infertility remains a curse even today. Thank you, ma'am.
Um, any questions? All right. With this, we move to the third presenter, Purushottam Rajak.
Yes, yes, ma'am. I'm here.
Yeah, you may please start.
Okay. So, thank you, ma'am. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the organizers who have given me the opportunity to be a part of this wonderful conference. So, the title of my paper is Queer Desire and Heteronormativity Exploring Alternative Sexuality in Amrita Patil's Curry. Though earlier graphic writings are considered as comic, non-serious, non-academic stuff which can provide only cheap entertainment, but nowadays it gradually emerging as a potential medium to satirize the follies of modern society through a brilliant fusion of word and images. The visible aspects of graphic novels is capable of engaging the reader in far more better way than ever. In the constellation of great Indian graphic writer Amrita Patil, always derives significant attention of the reader as he used her literary talent as a medium to dissect the tabooed and prejudiced issues Indian society. In her very first novel, she trades into the world of forbidden territory uh, and she foregrounded the lived realities of an unusual protagonist into the world of graphic novel. Once in an interview, she herself said, and I quote, I wanted to send out an unusual protagonist into the Indian literary scene, a young, deeply introverted, a social queer woman, counterpoint to the hyper feminine prototypes one keeps coming across. So before I would like to slightly touch upon the history of queer sexuality in India. Though India is a country which loves to celebrate its unity in the midst of diversity, but when we try to look it into the through the lenses of queer theory, it appears grim, bleak, and dysphoric. Before the phenomenal judgment of Indian Supreme Court decriminalizing Section 377, any sexual orientation against the law of nature were considered as crime and were punishable by the law. And due to such constitutional criminalization, and homophobic hostility, India's transgressive population used to confine themselves within a narrow closet of their own, either in shame or in fear. Thus, the sexual dissidents usually maintains an invisibility to put a mark over their to put a mask over their original self to march with the norm. But a careful reading of ancient Indian religious and mythological text unfolds how the issue of was treated sympathetically earlier. Kama Sutra, an ancient Indian text on sexuality, considered mutual attraction between the same sex as Tritya Prakriti within quote. Ruth Vanita, a great Indian scholar, in her book, she marked 19th century as a milestone, and she says, and I quote, as a crucial period of transition when the minor strain of pre-colonial homophobia became the dominant voice in the colonial and the post-colonial mainstream discourse. She pointed out, she pointed out how the Victorian puritanical attitude got imposed in the Indian society. She also explored how, in this country, writer writer on the queer issues, on the taboo issues, on the prejudice issues, used to undergo several kinds of victimization. And regarding that, she also says, and I quote, modern Indian heterosexism continues to be manifested in the politics of receptions and canon formation and misreading. Writers, moreover, however gifted, who are openly gay or lesbian, suffers critical neglect. Unquote. This is some extent true about the queer text. Amruta Patil is very vividly put forth in the put for the lived realities and the anxieties and the inner turmoil of a young woman whose sexual orientation is towards women. It unfolds the emotional ties between Kari and her lover, Ruth, at the backdrop of homophobic Indian society. Co- and it also expresses the quest for a stable identity and constant longing for a space where she can feel accepted. Living in a dominant heterosexist country, living is not an easy task for the people with transgressive desire. Most of the people consider it as a pathological condition which can be cured. A very close friend of Curry, the protagonist of the graphic novel that is I'm about which I'm talking about, in that novel, the very close friend of Curry, Ledgerus once asked her whether she is a proper lesbian or not. Uh, After all, she believes that a man, after a certain point of time, needs a woman, and a woman needs a man. A society is not ready to accept their love for each other, and to lose the burden of unacceptancy, and they attempted suicide. As the cover page said, and I quote, they were insufferable until the day they jumped. Ruth, saved by safety nets, leaves the city. Curry, saved by the sewer, crawls back into the fray of living. So, unquote. Her crawling is a metaphoric of her inner pangs, which are unable to make a clear movement through the through heterosexist nations. The setting of the novel is very interesting indeed. The city Bombay, which is considered as as the most progressive metropolitan city, appears in the narrative and images as the cruel oppressor where our protagonist feels suffocated. The city is referred as smog city, which connotes the symbolic invisibility of the queer character in general. The smog is functional to put a marks over the identity, what the established norms of the society are not accepted to come out. The novel artistically exposes how queer character in the heterosexist homophobic society appears as a panopticon where they are living with a constant fear of being looked at. Such a discrimination of heteronormative gauge Curry's body form into a Curry's body turned into a docile body, what Foucault says in Discipline and Punishment. The queer characters are not radical in this novel, rather they are submissive. Uh, they are not rebellious against the strict laws of the laws and prejudice attitude of the society, but I must say their very silence is their protest. The very presence of queer issue in the Indian literary arena itself produces an ample resistance towards the hegemonic heteronormativity in the mainstream literature. Thank you, ma'am.
All right. Any questions for the presenter? All right. I think there isn't any. So I would now ask Nina Sunny to make a presentation.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, ma'am. I'm Nina Sunny, pursuing PhD at Vellore Institute of Technology, Vellore. My title for today's presentation is Language Gender Nexus, a comparative study of Amy Tan's Valley of Amazement and Anita Nair's Idris, Keeper of the Light. I have chosen two books, one from an American author, Amy Tan. She was born in America, and her major themes include Chinese immigrant issues, mother-daughter relationships, and husband and wife relationship. The book was published in 2013. And the next author is Anita Nair. She is born in Kerala, and her major themes are gender inequality, family relationships, and family social positioning of women. And the book Idris, Keeper of the Light was published in 2014. So language mirrors the mind. It is a medium of converting meaning into signals. Roger Webster has well remarked in studying literary theory and introduction, quote, language is a twofold or binary system. Such a system consists of a code which is conveyed through verbal as well as visual sign, which have agreed concepts as meaning attached, unquote. Language is one of the wonders of the natural world. It can shape events in a person's mind with exactness. Human beings diverge from other species because of this one preeminent trait, that is language. Language shapes this world, it molds our thoughts and ideas. People cannot imagine a life without language. In the book, The Language Instinct by Stephen Pinker, he says, quote, language is a distinct piece of biological makeup of our brains. Language is complex, specialized skill which develops in the child spontaneously without conscious effort or formal instruction, is deployed without awareness of its underlying logic, is qualitatively the same in every individual, and it is distinct from more general abilities to process information or to behave intelligently, unquote. Language is entwined in our human experience that it has become impossible to live without it. Children learn language without reflection. They acquire it as they grow. Children learn language from first and then they will start focusing on other knowledge. It is the foundation for most learning. Whether it be social skills, facts, or moral skills, the acquisition of language is the first step. Gender is the social construction of sex difference. It is a set of expectations from the society based on a person's sex. If you are born a boy, you have to walk, talk, and behave like a boy. Similarly, if you are born a girl, you need to have certain emphasizing traits which is set by the society. And then only you would be labeled as the ideal woman. Betty Friedan, in her work, The Feminine Mystic, defines the stereotype ideal woman as quote, sexual passivity, male domination, and nurturing maternal love, unquote. Culture modes your gender. There are a set of standards set by culture, and each person, depending on their gender, need to act according to these regulations. Gender stereotypes perpetuates inequality in the society. Gender is everything that a person vouches about himself or herself in order to be denominated as a boy or a girl, or as a man or a woman. One question that arises when trying to find out the connection between language and gender is how the idea of gender is proliferated through language. Simone de Beauvoir, in her work The Second Sex, says, one is not born a woman, but rather becomes a woman, unquote. Women tend to use language that augment their subordinate role in the society. The ideas femininity and masculinity are social constructs. They are not inherently present in a society, but rather is imprinted through repeated action, and thus it would end up becoming a custom that everyone should adhere to. Gendered speech is also a part of this custom. The idea of gender existed in our society eons ago. It is being passed on from one generation to another. A child is then expected to act and perform based on these norms. Both men and women are perpetrators of this idea of gender. A child from its birth is taught on how to behave based on his or her gender. It is through language that these ideas are communicated. Language can be influenced and controlled by someone in order to reveal his or her power. Power is practiced through language. Bias is visible in the grammatical structure of most of the languages. There are set rules on how a woman should speak and how a man should speak. All these ideas are circulated through language, and everyone in a society is responsible for passing on these concepts. Bell Hooks in her work The Will to Change Men, Masculinity, and Love says, quote, from that time on, I began to think that women were afraid to speak openly about men, afraid to explore deeply our connections to them, what we have witnessed as daughters, sisters, grandmothers, mothers, aunts, lovers, occasional sex objects, and afraid even to acknowledge our ignorance. Unquote. Men are always considered as valiant, chivalric, and full of pride. In the above lines, Belhook says that from time immemorial, men are always portrayed as the gender who inflicts pain and choose violence over peace. This is something which is registered in our mind about men and masculinity. Women, on the other hand, is docile and does not support violence. This idea has been passing on to people through language. The theory of gender varies from time to time. It is not static. The concept is widely spread through day to day conversational between people. Judith Butler, in her influential work, Gender Trouble, says, quote, gender is something that is done and is something that has to be done over and over again. Gender is this repeated stylization of the body, a set of repeated acts within a rigid regulatory framework which congeal over time to produce appearance of substance of a natural kind of being, unquote. John Gray, in his book Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, says, quote, not only do men and women communicate differently, but they think, feel, perceive, react, respond, love, and appreciate differently. They almost seem to be different from different planets, speaking different languages, and needing different nourishment, unquote. John Gray tries to emphasize the stereotype that men and women are different in every way. This kind of binary thinking through language harms the society and thus it creates division. Next, culture determines the position of a man and woman in a society. It is based on culture that men and women perceive themselves. Women view themselves as subordinates to men and they imbibe this position from their childhood experiences. Both mother and father partake in this process of teaching their daughter or son the rules of stereotype gender. Women are subjugated in two ways, the way they are taught to use language and how general language treats them. Sexist language makes women take up certain subservient functions. They'll be portrayed as sex objects or servants who are supposed to act according to the whims of men. Amy Tan's The Value of Amazement limns about the lives of courtesans in Shanghai. The title itself is ironical. A courtesan house is compared to a valley of flowers and amazement. For the outside world, it is a place filled with surprise and luxury. But the courtesans live there by selling their true identities. The courtesans are compared to flowers that are delicate and delightful to watch. In literature, women are mostly sketched as weak, powerless, whiny, with beautiful physicality. When people read misogynistic works, the idea of how a woman should be gets wired in the reader's mind. This idea would then get propagated to other people through conversations. In The Value of Amazement, Amy Tan explicitly shows the femininity of women. The courtesans in her work are named after delicate objects. The courtesans were known as cloud beauties. A few of their names were Rosy Cloud, Billowy Cloud, Snowy Cloud, Magic Cloud. These names suggest ways of assigning gender to objects through language. The protagonist's name is Violet. She says, quote, my mother named me Violet after a tiny flower she loved as a girl growing up in San Francisco, unquote. All these names suggest that a woman is fragile and soft. Just like a flower, these courtesans only have a short span of time to do their work. Quote, most have been 13 or 14 when they have arrived and would be 23 or 24 when they left, unquote. In The Valley of Amazement, the female characters are living in a society which has gender bias. From their childhood, they are taught how to conduct oneself as a woman. The protagonist Violet in the book learns how to become a successful courtesan. In order to attract men, these women are taught how to talk and walk like a lady. Although Magic God had returned as a courtesan 6 years ago, she had remained attentive to her best features, her perfect skin and graceful undulating walk that acted like a switch in throwing her hips from side to side, unquote. Next is Anita Nayar's Idris, Keeper of the Light. The author delineates the life of two women, Kuttimalu and Tilottama. Kuttimalu loved irregularities in her life. She went against all the traditions in her house, but she only did it secretly. She craved for knowledge but never got it. Her mother always taunted her for her zest-filled character. Her mother says, God, why can't you be like other girls? Why do you always have to be different? Girls from their childhood are taught to be little ladies. Lakoff in her work, Language and Women's Place, says, "Caught, as children, women are encouraged to be little ladies. Little ladies don't scream vociferously as little boys, and they are chastised more severely for throwing tantrums and showing temper. High spirit are expected and therefore tolerated in little boys. Docility and resignation are the corresponding traits expected of little girls." Unquote. The other character, Tilottama, was also a girl filled with enthusiasm and fire in her to conquer the world, but everyone tried to stamp out the eagerness in her. Her grandfather asked her this question, quote, "Didn't your mother teach you that girls shouldn't be curious?" Unquote. This is how, through language, that people quench a woman's desire for knowledge. In her work, Bodies That Matter, on the discursive limits of sex, Judith Butler gives voice to the role of power, that is, the stereotype masculinity in the formation of our gender. She says, quote, "I draw on the notion of immanence of power as operating within and through the formation and materialization of identities." Unquote. Tilottama in Idris, Keeper of the Light, is a true embodiment of female masculinity. She is an independent woman and earns her bread by herself. She acts like a man with power in order to sustain in a society filled with misogynists. Her language is filled with power and she lives her life according to her whims. Her logic about life was irrefutable to others. Tilottama took Tilottama took to walking with dogs. No one dared to approach
Please
her.
conclude.
Yes,
Please
ma'am.
conclude.
Yes, ma'am. Since her childhood, the only thing that she listens from her mother is how to be a complete woman. It is well-known fact that a woman who thinks differently is considered as an outcast by societal norms. So, in order to get asserted in the society, she acted and talked like a man. From the linguistic articulations of her mother, Tilottama imitates men and masculine traits, leaving aside her femininity. This is the connection between language and gender. When you constantly hear articulations that men are significant entity of the society and women are subordinate, Tilottama took the position of man and acted like one to show her pattern. In the present scenario, there are women who try to act and speak like men, but a man would never take up the language or role of women. The language of the favored group that hold the power, along with its non-linguistic behavior, is generally adopted by the other group, not the vice versa. From the select works and the subsequent application of language gender discourse, the role language plays in propagating patriarchy, irrespective of gender, is illustrated through the paper. Hence, the comparative reading of Anita Nayar and Amy Tan indicates that the politics of language and gender traverse across literary as well as geographical boundaries, leaving women's life as stick. Thank you.
Just
Ma'am?
yeah, with this, yeah. With this, we have reached. No, we have one more presenter. I'm very sorry. Do we have Sadia?
Yes, ma'am.
All right.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to present my paper. This is Sadia Gul, research scholar from Baba Ghulam Shah Badshah University. The title of my paper is Conflict Calling for Women's Narrative in Literature. Human civilization since its inception and evolution had coped with conflict to vie for resources. The impact of conflict adequately works on men, women, and children. However, women's narrative in conflict by women is absent. There is an augmented vulnerability seen in case of women in its approach to conflict. The experience and narratives about women in conflict by women themselves are insufficient. When one delves into Kashmir conflict and women, the story from women's perspective by a woman is non non-existent. Farah Bashir, writer from Kashmir, is one who came up with a girl's story in a conflict-stricken region of Kashmir. Farah's memoir, Rumors of Spring, A Girlhood in Kashmir, gives an account of an adolescent girl who is growing up and afflicted by conflict circumstances. This paper studies women's narrative from women's perspective, their sufferings and resilience. The impact of conflict is always precarious on women, and when one looks at the impact of Kashmir conflict upon women, it's tear-jerking and saddening. The writer Farah Bashir, brought up in conflict-riddled zone in Kashmir, comes with a woman's voice and peeps through women's perspective in her memoir, Rumors of Spring, A Girlhood in Kashmir. Farah Bashir, a writer and a journalist from Kashmir, aware of the fact that women's perspective, suffering, impact, and narrative in conflict-shaken region of Kashmir are missing, comes with a girl's story. How a girl grows up in a conflict stricken zone which is haunted by uncertainties and insecurities, where each time a moment of merry turns to mourn. Farah unbolts the windows and doors that depict the inner psyche, inner feeling, and indoor life experiences of the very common mundane domestic life. How day to day banal aspect of life, imprisoned within the walls, is impregnated with insecurity, anxiety, and fear. Farah has put subtle elements into the narratives which have become the new normal for people living in conflict region. The unheeded experience of cautiously stepping the wooden stairs inside the house so as not to invite unwanted attention from outside. The antipathy towards the food that brings the memory of death with it, like the dish of potato and lamb meat brings the memory of curfews, and the dish palak kokur, which is spinach with chicken, brings the memory of an innocent cousin's death. On the day he died on Eid, Farah's mother cooked spinach with chicken. The account of horrible sleepless nights with spasmodic pain of period cycles that go unheeded for medicine because stepping outside the room would bring family into nitrate trouble. The loss of very first love because the love letters can't be posted as the post office was blazed into the fire. All such imperative expression of womanhood which hardly gets acknowledged and counted find their articulation through Farah's registered memory in her memoir. When a woman is put to challenge and loses the agency to act, she turns to her body and injures it. It is the body that is in her control. Farah also narrates her experience of self-afflicting pain. She is not able to process the chaos and conflict, concomitant with fear, anxiety, and insecurities, where she used to pull the strand of her hair, turning bald patches out of it. In her interview, she states the period of 90s was stepping into nightmare and you don't know how to process it. Naima Mahjoor, another writer from Kashmir, says women have to say if they are not heard, then they should shout to make themselves heard. Farah's memoir, in that perspective, is very loud as it was able to draw the ears of others to listen to her silent struggles and battles that go unnoticed. The unwomanly face of a war, a book written by Svetlana Elizavich, states that women's perspective often get unrepresented in wars because whatever is happening outside the houses, on roads and streets comes into the limelight as there is heroism for showing physical bravery and killing. Farah comes with her counter narrative that it is the women who comes with her moral courage in such situation where it is itself an act of heroism. Women are vulnerable in conflict circumstances, suffering silently, but still they manage to put on a brave mask on their faces, absorbing the traumas. They show strong resilience. Farah put her narrative with the onset of a girl entering into womanhood in a conflict stricken zone when she is having her board exams. The memoir starts like this. It was a chilly December evening in 1994. I had turned 18 that year. It was the day when she witnessed the death of her grandmother. Her death, among other deaths, was different as she died a natural death instead of being blown into pieces by a bomb or being shot by a gun. It was the day she attended her first paper amidst curfew, where her roll number slip doubled as curfew passed, and when she returned home, it was uncertainty that baffled her on seeing the commotion of people. Farah says, "My heart sank. Was someone hit by a bullet? Who could it be? Was father injured at the shop? Was mother hit by a granite shell or a sharp nail?" In addition to her vocalization of women's perspective about heart-wrenching incident, she has put forth Other 14 women's narrative, how conflict has impacted women, where it seeped into women's indoor life and how they suffered, what has been their resilience. Jahan Galting, conflict theorist, stated that impact of conflict is always violence, and his concept of violence is profound, that include both somatic and insomatic aspects that are physical as well as psychological. In Farah's memoir, we witness both forms of violence, the tangible and intangible ones. As Farah narrates how a young girl in a conflict area becomes conscious of her womanhood and her body. For the cause of being vulnerable, it is the impact of living in conflict and war zone she realized entering into womanhood. She says, on the deserted streets of my neighborhood, in the presence of so many military bunkers and the gaze of unknown men, inside them I suddenly became aware of my body and its contour. I felt naked. The conflict even impacted her pangs of pain during periods. Her cramps that last for days also worsen her condition at night as she can't go for proper medication. The conflict even impacted her future, her education, as she loses her interest in her studies amidst massive bloodshed and killing. Farah puts it, people were struggling to stay alive. How did my distinction matter? The extreme precariousness and poignancy affected her set of well-being and of others. She says, 3 years later, a reflection of Jaji appeared in my mirror when I too was prescribed sedatives and SSRI medications. Farah lost her sense of appetite for food, as the food used to bring the memory of ill omens brought by conflict. Farah and other family members, including her grandmother, suffered from suffocation by inhaling lung burning tear gases within the four walls of their house. The home no longer remained the same that promised coziness, peace, and content. Instead, the four-walled house, with all windows shut, served to cocoon them, attained the form of prison. The house could be raided at any time, and the rice store in the storeroom could be smashed with coal beds by the intruders. The conflict even restricted the mobility of a young girl who craves for a walk, an ordinary activity which would be no less than a dream coming true. Young Farah anomaly shows concern about this new normal. She writes, why are people okay with not walking? Does father not miss his daily walks to shrine and shop? I miss playing hopscotch on street. I miss walking in the courtyard and run to buy kintha. Galting in his essay Cultural Violence states cultural violence is the violence which becomes acceptable at the cultural level or at least justified and is not even questioned. This cultural violence prevailing in Farah's memoir, which people had accepted as a norm and is left unquestioned, is put into question by Farah. Athar Zia, the writer who writes on Kashmir conflict, who writes on Kashmir conflict and women, discusses how women resilience in a conflict scenario in her book Resisting Disappearance, Military Occupation and Women's Activism in Kashmir. Atharvia propounds the concept of effective law that means the constant struggle of women in everyday life and a ceaseless effort to invoke justice and memory. Farah portrayed the silent signs of resilience in her memoir, like when curfews are imposed, the family members communicate through windows to the outside world. When tear gases and pepper gases worsened their lungs, they kept water near and wet cloths handy. When a woman lost her son in a forceful disappearance, she would struggle to search for him and visit shrines for his safe coming. Jim Scott, in his book Weapon of Weak, states that there is a day to day mechanism of showing resilience used in subtle gestures, symbols, or in a wild form of discourse. James maintained that tormented and weak also imbibe his source of power and gets displayed through the subtle gesture. Farah Memoir addresses to the subtle gestures of showing resilience. When a sister loses her innocent brother, she would sing a dirge for him. Farah also shows her strong
I'm
resilience.
afraid, Sadia, please, you'll have to be a little quick.
Yes, ma'am, I'm concluding. Farah also shows her strong resilience first through drawing sketches and later to cope with the nightmare of conflict. She started registering everything in her school diary, which later came in a form of memoirs to us. Farah has set the benchmark for others to come forward for a women's narrative about conflict and women, their struggle, suffering, and resilience. There is a heartfelt expectation that in the coming years, the women narrative by women will expand and it will open new windows of women's experience. This brings us to the end of this paper. Hope it was insightful. Thank you for patiently listening me. Thank you.
Any question for her? All right. With this, we have come to the conclusion of technical session 4. And I would like to congratulate all the presenters, all the researchers who brought out great ideas on women, on patriarchy, and talked about women in literature. So it was an honor to be here. Thank you. I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to witness such effective academic deliberation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am, for being with us throughout the session. And I would like to thank all the presenters who presented their paper.